The silver fork in Eleanor's hand clattered against her vintage porcelain plate, the sharp metallic screech cutting straight through the soft jazz playing from the old Sony stereo in the corner. You're dead," she whispered, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling so violently that a drop of gravy splashed onto the pristine, starched white Thanksgiving tablecloth. Abigail stood in the doorway of the dining room, the cold Boston November wind still clinging to the wool of her black Burberry trench coat. She didn't smile, nor did she look angry, her face was as calm and unreadable as the frozen surface of the Charles River. She slowly unbuttoned her coat, revealing a tailored charcoal suit that screamed Wall Street, and slipped a small, rectangular tin from her pocket. She popped a peppermint into her mouth, the sharp, biting crunch echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. "Not dead, Mother. Just expensive to keep," Abigail said, her voice dropping into a smooth, low register that sounded like a late-night radio host delivering bad news. "Though, 15 years ago, when you left a 10-year-old girl at the St. Jude's receiving home with nothing but a duffel bag and a forged consent form, I suppose I became dead to this budget." Thomas, sitting at the head of the table, froze with his carving knife halfway through the turkey. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson, the veins on his neck bulging against his loosened silk tie. "Abigail? What kind of stunt is this? How dare you barge into my house on a holiday, talking like a lunatic?" He tried to throw his shoulders back, to summon the old, terrifying authority of the patriarch who used to lock her in the basement for spilling juice, but his eyes were darting frantically to the front window, checking if the neighbors had seen the sleek, black Lincoln Continental parked at his curb. "Your house, Thomas?" Abigail stepped into the room, her heels clicking with a heavy, deliberate rhythm against the worn oak floorboards. "That's an interesting choice of words, considering the bank notified you of the foreclosure assessment 3 weeks ago. Let's open the windows and talk about numbers, shall we?" From the corner of the table, a young man in his early 20s, sporting a faded college varsity jacket and a gold watch that looked slightly too big for his wrist, slammed his fist down. "Hey! Who the hell do you think you are? You don't come in here and talk to my dad like that." This was Julian. The golden boy. The son who was worth keeping. The reason Abigail's childhood bedrooms had been emptied and sold to pay for private hockey lessons. Abigail finally turned her gaze to him. She looked him up and down, noticing the subtle tremor in his fingers and the way his eyes avoided hers, the classic tell of a gambler who had spent the afternoon staring at a losing screen on an offshore poker app. "You must be Julian," she said softly, almost pityingly. "The $1 million boy. Or, based on your current accounts at the Bellagio, the negative $80,000 boy. Don't worry, little brother. Your debts aren't a secret to the people who buy them." Julian's face went entirely white. He sank back into his chair, his bravado vanishing like smoke in a drafty room. "What do you want, Abigail?" Eleanor's voice was cracked, the carefully cultivated image of the elegant, church-going suburban mother fraying at the edges. She clutched a lace handkerchief to her throat, her eyes pinned to the heavy, leather-bound folder Abigail now placed deliberately next to the untouched mashed potatoes. "If you're here for an apology, it was a different time. We were drowning in debt. The business was failing, and we had to choose, we had to ensure the family name survived." "The family name," Abigail repeated, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. She opened the folder. Inside lay a single, pristine piece of paper with the watermark of the Vanguard Maritime Trust. "Let's not romanticize human trafficking by calling it financial planning, Eleanor. You gave me away because the sonogram said Julian had a penis, and you thought a daughter was a luxury liability. But life has a very wicked sense of irony." She slid the paper across the table. It stopped precisely between Thomas's trembling hands. "Arthur Vance died last month," Abigail said, her tone completely detached, as if she were reading a weather report. "The eccentric shipping magnate who adopted me from that state-run warehouse after you stopped paying my foster care subsidies. He left a net estate of $42 million. And as his sole legal heir, I am now the primary shareholder of the regional credit firm that holds the secondary mortgage on this very roof over your heads." Thomas stared at the document, his lips moving silently as his eyes scanned the legal headers and the staggering rows of zeros on the attached asset summary. His hand, which had been tightly gripping the carving knife, began to go slack. 42 million, he breathed, his voice suddenly losing all its gravel, replaced by a hollow, desperate awe. Eleanor leaned over, her eyes widening as she drank in the numbers. The disgust and terror that had painted her face moments before began to melt away, replaced by something much older and far more insidious, pure, unadulterated greed. She looked up at Abigail, her voice shifting into a nauseatingly sweet, trembling register. Abigail, oh, my sweet girl. We never stopped thinking about you. Every Christmas, I prayed, if we had only known you were safe, that you had found such success. Abigail watched the transformation with a clinical detachment. It was exactly as Arthur had predicted in his final days at the hospice, his voice raspy but sharp. They won't hate you for coming back rich, Abby. They'll hate themselves for not keeping the goose that could lay the golden eggs. Use that. Let their own hunger build the cage. I'm sure you prayed, Eleanor. Especially when the property taxes came due, Abigail said, her voice dripping with cool irony. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a fountain pen, and laid it on top of the trust documents. The bank was going to auction this house in January. I bought the debt this morning. I can write a check right now to clear the title, pay off Julian's friends in Atlantic City, and set up a monthly stipend that would allow you to keep pretending to be the royalty of this subdivision. Thomas's chest rose and fell rapidly. He looked at the pen, then at his wife, then at the daughter he hadn't seen since she was a crying 10-year-old clutching a stuffed bear. What's the catch? He asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Nothing is free. Not from a ghost. Abigail stood up, smoothing the front of her suit jacket. She looked around the dining room, at the faded wallpaper she used to trace with her fingers, at the built-in china cabinet that held the plates she was never allowed to use. It felt smaller now. Shabbier. Like a stage set whose paint was peeling in the dark. No catch. Just a restructuring, Abigail said, walking back toward the hallway. I've laid out a family partnership agreement on page 4. It gives me full administrative control over all major family assets and decisions in exchange for liquidity. Review it with a lawyer. Or don't. You have until Sunday morning, before the church bells ring. She pulled open the heavy front door, letting the sharp, biting winter air rush into the overheated house, clearing out the smell of roasted meat and old secrets. Oh, and Julian? Abigail paused on the threshold, turning her head just enough for the porch light to catch the sharp angle of her jaw. Stop playing the river on a pair of jacks. It's a terrible habit. Good night, family. She closed the door behind her with a soft, solid thud that sounded remarkably like a vault locking from the outside. As she walked down the stone path toward the waiting sedan, the icy air hit her face, but she didn't shiver. She reached into her pocket, took out another peppermint, and let the cold sweetness numb her tongue. Behind her, through the thin curtains of the dining room window, she could already hear the muffled, rising pitch of voices, the immediate, frantic argument between a mother, a father, and a son about how to divide a pie they hadn't even been invited to bake. The first crack in the foundation had been found. Now, she just had to wait for the frost to do its work. The Monday morning after Thanksgiving in Boston always smelled of wet asphalt, cheap diner coffee, and the impending misery of winter. Abigail sat in the corner booth of the Rusty Anchor, a low-ceilinged diner 3 blocks from her childhood home where the vinyl seats were held together by duct tape and the waitresses called everyone Han without looking up from their order pads. She was cutting a stack of blueberry pancakes into mathematically precise squares, though she hadn't taken a single bite. Across from her sat Marcus, Arthur Vance's longtime corporate attorney, looking spectacularly out of place in a $4,000 bespoke suit that was currently absorbing the grease of 40 years of fried bacon. "You're playing a dangerous game, Abby," Marcus said, blowing on his black coffee. "The trust guidelines specify that you must dismantle their economic and social standing to trigger the final release of the maritime liquid assets. But handing them a $3 million corporate restructuring plan? That looks like a lifeline, not an execution. Abigail popped a square pancake into her mouth, chewed thoughtfully, and shook her head. If you want a rotten tree to fall, Marcus, you don't chop at the trunk with a dull axe. You overwater it. You make the fruit so heavy that the branches snap under their own greed. Besides, have you met my brother? Marcus groaned, rubbed his temples, and pulled a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase. Julian. Yes. I ran the background check you requested. The boy is a walking financial black hole. He's currently driving a leased BMW he can't afford, he owes a local bookie named Big Sal $11,000, and he's been stealing money from his mother's flower arranging club fund to cover his online poker margins. Perfect, Abigail murmured, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth. He's the perfect accelerator. Did my parents sign the preliminary agreement? They did, Marcus said, sliding a document across the sticky table. Thomas practically bit my hand off trying to grab the pen. Eleanor kept asking if the family partnership meant they could get a corporate discount on a country club membership in Brookline. They genuinely believe you've returned as the dutiful, guilt-ridden daughter who just wants her daddy's approval. Abigail laughed, a short, sharp, barking sound that had no humor in it. They forgot that when they left me at St. Jude's, they didn't just leave a kid. They left a liability. Arthur taught me how to turn liabilities into leverage. What about the house? The deed is being transferred into AV Holdings, your shell corporation, as collateral for the first $500,000 cash infusion, Marcus confirmed, his voice dropping to a whisper as a waitress poured more coffee. The moment that money hits their account, they are legally tenant occupants in their own home. If they default on a single performance metric of the restructuring plan, you can evict them with a 24-hour notice. Let's make sure they get the money by noon today, Abigail said, sliding the pancakes away and pulling out her mint tin. I want Julian to feel the warmth of that cash before the sun goes down. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Abigail was sitting in the back of her parked Lincoln across the street from the family home. The house looked even more pathetic in the gray afternoon light. The white paint was flaking off the clapboards like dead skin, and the gutters were overflowing with dead oak leaves. Suddenly, the front door flew open. Julian stumbled out onto the porch, clutching a thick FedEx envelope to his chest as if it were a newborn baby. He was shouting into his iPhone, his face lit up with a manic, terrifying joy. I told you, man. I told you I'd get the cash. Julian yelled into the phone, pacing frantically across the dead brown lawn. Tell Sal I've got his 11 grand, plus interest. And tell him to clear my seat at the private table tonight. I'm back in the game. My sister just dropped $500,000 on us. She's a soft touch, man. Total sucker. She's trying to buy her way back into the family. In the back seat of the car, Abigail leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, a faint, cold smile playing on her lips. A soft touch, she whispered to herself. Enjoy the sunshine, little brother. The frost is coming. The comedy began around midnight. Abigail had stayed in the neighborhood, catching up on corporate emails from her phone while parked in the dark driveway of an abandoned house 2 doors down. She knew Julian's patterns. A boy like that, with $500,000 sitting in a joint family account, wouldn't be able to sleep. Through the dark, she watched a figure creep out of the side door of the family house. It was Julian, wearing a dark hoodie, moving with all the stealth of an obese raccoon in a trash can. He crept across the street, his eyes darting around, and approached Abigail's parked Lincoln. He didn't see her behind the heavily tinted windows of the back seat. Julian approached the driver's side door, slipped a wire coat hanger through the rubber weather stripping, and began frantically jiggling the lock. He was sweating profusely despite the 30-degree weather, his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. He was clearly looking for the leather folder she had brought to Thanksgiving dinner, the one he thought contained the rest of the $3 million contracts. Abigail didn't roll down the window. She didn't scream. Instead, she simply reached forward and pressed the button for the car's panic alarm. The horn began to blare in a deafening, rhythmic scream, *beep. Beep. Beep, The headlights flashed violently, illuminating Julian's face like a deer caught in a high-powered spotlight. Holy shit! Julian shrieked, dropping the coat hanger and falling backward onto the icy pavement. He scrambled like a crab, his hoodie catching on a stray rosebush by the sidewalk, tearing the fabric with a loud RIP. Across the street, the lights in the master bedroom flicked on. Thomas appeared at the window in his faded flannel pajamas, holding a golf club and looking wildly around the yard like an aging, confused suburban warrior. Julian managed to untangle himself from the bush, losing one of his expensive sneakers in the process, and sprinted back across the street in his socks, slamming the front door behind him just as the neighbor's porch lights began to pop on one by one. Abigail turned off the alarm with her key fob. The silence returned to the street, heavy and cold. She picked up her phone and sent a one-sentence text to Marcus. The mouse is already chewing through the wires. Schedule the community barbecue for Saturday. Let's bring the neighbors. The Oaks of Maplewood was the kind of New England neighborhood where people judged your moral character by the crispness of your lawn edges and the brand of your outdoor grill. Saturday afternoon was unseasonably warm for late November, and the annual pre-winter block barbecue was in full swing in the cul-de-sac. Thomas stood behind his giant, stainless steel Weber grill, wearing an apron that read "The Grill King" in bold letters. He was flipping burgers with an aggressive, cheerful energy, holding a cold Bud Light and laughing loudly at a joke made by Mr. Henderson from down the street. "Oh, you know how it is, Arthur," Thomas boomed, intentionally raising his voice so the wives gathered around the potato salad table could hear. "Family is everything. When my Abigail made her fortune in the shipping business, the first thing she did was come straight home to her old man. 'Dad,' she told me, 'I want to invest in the family.' That's how we raised her. High standards. Family first." Eleanor was practically glowing next to him, draped in a cream-colored cashmere sweater that Abigail's first wire transfer had paid for. She was pouring lemonade for Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood gossip-in-chief. "Yes, it was so hard when we sent her to that exclusive European boarding school at age 10, Eleanor sighed, dabbing her eye with a napkin for theatrical effect. "But look at her now. A true success. It was worth every sacrifice we made." Abigail watched this performance from 30 yards away, leaning against the hood of her black Lincoln. She was wearing a simple cream trench coat that perfectly mirrored Eleanor's sweater, but on Abigail, it looked like armor. She popped a fresh peppermint into her mouth, her eyes fixed on her mother's moving lips. "They're selling the product well," Marcus said softly, stepping out of the passenger seat. He was holding a leather briefcase disguised as a standard legal folio. "The neighbors genuinely think you're a family miracle. Are you ready to issue the recall notice?" "Let them get a little hungrier first," Abigail whispered. She began to walk toward the center of the cul-de-sac. As she approached, the chatter shifted. The neighbors parted like the Red Sea, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and curiosity. A girl who disappears at 10 and returns 15 years later with a private driver and $1 million trust fund is the closest thing to a Hollywood production this suburb had ever seen. "Abigail. Sweetheart." Eleanor squealed, rushing forward to wrap her arms around Abigail. She smelled of expensive lavender perfume and cheap gin. "Come met the Hendersons. We were just telling them about your beautiful apartment in Beacon Hill." Abigail didn't lean into the hug. Her arms remained straight at her sides, stiff and unyielding. When Eleanor pulled back, looking slightly flustered by the cold response, Abigail looked directly at Mrs. Gable. "An exclusive European boarding school, Eleanor? Is that what you told the neighborhood?" Abigail's voice wasn't loud, but it had that late-night radio clarity that carried perfectly across the quiet, manicured lawns. Thomas froze, his spatula hovering over a burning sirloin patty. The smile on his face stayed fixed, but his jaw muscles began to twitch violently. "Abigail, honey, let's not talk shop at a barbecue. Come get a bratwurst." "I don't think I have an appetite for fiction today, Thomas," Abigail said, stepping closer to the grill. The neighbors fell completely silent. Even the kids playing lawn darts stopped to look. I'm just curious about the curriculum at this European boarding school. Because my memory of the place involves a gray linoleum floor, a single metal cot, and a social worker named Gertrude who told me my parents weren't coming back because they couldn't afford the storage fees on a daughter. Mrs. Gable's lemonade glass froze halfway to her mouth. What did she say? She murmured to the woman next to her. Abigail, shut your mouth. Thomas hissed, his face turning the color of a raw steak. He dropped his voice to a menacing whisper, stepping around the grill to block her from the neighbor's view. You don't do this here. Not in front of my friends. We gave you $500,000 of liquidity this week through your contract. You owe us respect. Correction, Thomas, Abigail said, her voice dropping into a register so cold it felt like a draft from an open meat locker. She reached into Marcus's folder and pulled out a laminated document. It was a certified copy of the state police report from November 14, 2011. You didn't send me to school, Abigail announced to the entire cul-de-sac, holding up the document. You filed a voluntary termination of parental rights at the Middlesex County Courthouse. The reason listed on line 12? Severe financial strain due to the medical and educational preservation of male heir. You abandoned a 10-year-old girl at a state shelter so you could buy Julian a customized hockey kit and pay off your secondary credit lines. That's a lie. Eleanor screamed, her elegant facade snapping like dry twigs. She pointed a trembling, diamond-ringed finger at Abigail. You're an ungrateful little bitch. We gave you life. You wouldn't be rich today if that shipping man hadn't found you. We did you a favor. The silence that followed Eleanor's scream was absolute. The neighborhood wives slowly began to back away from the potato salad table, their expressions shifting from curiosity to profound disgust. Thomas looked around at his peers, men he had shared beers with for 20 years, men he had lied to every single day about his brilliant daughter abroad. Mr. Henderson wouldn't look him in the eye. He looked down at his shoes, adjusting his barbecue apron with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. His tie, which he always wore to look professional even at a cookout, was crooked, choked tight against his throat. Julian! Thomas barked, looking around wildly for his son like a drowning man looking for a life vest. Julian, tell her to stop. Tell them she's crazy. But Julian wasn't looking at his father. He was standing near the edge of the driveway, staring at his phone, his face gray with a completely different kind of terror. He didn't care about the family honor. He had just received a notification that his online account had been frozen due to suspected fraudulent funds originating from a joint family trust. Abigail took a final bite of her peppermint, the loud crunch serving as the punctuation mark for the entire afternoon. Enjoy the burgers, everyone, Abigail said to the stunned crowd, turning her back on her parents without a second glance. The meat is paid for by the Vance Trust. But I'd check the expiration date on everything else in that house if I were you. As she walked back to the Lincoln, behind her, Eleanor began to wail, a shrill, ugly sound that echoed through the suburban trees. It wasn't the sound of a mother mourning a lost relationship, it was the sound of a woman realizing her social credit score had just hit absolute zero. The first layer of skin had been peeled back. The neighborhood would never look at the model family the same way again. The winter frost had finally locked Boston in its teeth by the second week of December. Inside the house on Maplewood Lane, the heat was turned down to 60 degrees. Not because the furnace was broken, but because the gas bill had arrived alongside a notice that the joint account containing Abigail's first $500,000 transfer had been legally frozen by the Vance Trust's Compliance Division. What do you mean, suspicious gambling activity? Thomas roared, his voice hoarse from days of shouting. He was standing in the dark living room, the only light coming from the flickering gray screen of the television. His hair was uncombed, and his favorite golf sweater was covered in coffee stains. Eleanor. Where is the boy? Where is Julian? Eleanor sat on the frayed edge of the sofa, her face puffy from crying. She didn't look like the queen of the flower arranging club anymore. She looked like an old woman who had forgotten to put on her makeup for a week. He's in his room, Thomas. He locked the door. He says there are men in cars parked down the street. Men in cars? Thomas slammed his fist onto the coffee table, rattling the empty beer cans. He spent the money. He took the corporate liquidity Abigail gave us to save this house, and he threw it into a digital sewer. Suddenly, the front door lock clicked. Abigail walked into the house without knocking. She didn't take off her coat this time. She stood in the center of the dark living room, her eyes cold and sharp. Behind her stood Marcus, carrying a stack of bright red legal notices. She popped a peppermint into her mouth, the sharp, minty scent cutting through the stale smell of old takeout food and fear. "Good evening, Thomas." "Eleanor," Abigail said, her tone as professional as an undertaker's. "I see you've begun conserving energy. That's excellent corporate efficiency. You did this." Eleanor shrieked, springing from the couch and rushing toward Abigail, her nails clawing at the air. "You froze the account. You wanted us to fail." Marcus stepped forward, dropping a heavy document onto the table with a dull thud. "Mrs. Vance, your son Julian attempted to wire $410,000 of the trust's corporate development funds to a shell account registered to an online betting operation in Antigua within 48 hours of deposit. That constitutes felony embezzlement under the terms of the partnership agreement you signed." Thomas felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. He looked at the document, his eyes swimming over the terms, Section 9, misappropriation of liquidity. Penalty, immediate acceleration of secondary debt, foreclosure of primary collateral, and referral to criminal prosecution. "Abigail, please," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking completely. He dropped his knees onto the worn carpet, his hands reaching out toward her tailored trousers. "He's your brother. He made a mistake. He's young. He has a future." "I was 10, Thomas," Abigail said, not stepping back, but looking down at him with a detachment that was far more terrifying than anger. "Was I not young? Did I not have a future? When you signed the paperwork at St. Jude's, did you ask the social worker if the shelter had a future for me? That was different." Eleanor yelled from the sofa, clutching her head. "We were desperate. We had to save the name." "And now the name is worth nothing," Abigail replied smoothly. "By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the Boston police will receive the audit report detailing Julian's wire fraud. Unless..." The room went entirely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Unless what?" Thomas breathed, looking up with a pathetic flash of hope in his eyes. "Anything, Abigail. We'll do anything." "The Vance Trust is prepared to offer an amendment," Marcus explained, pulling out a final, single sheet of paper. "We will clear the secondary mortgage and drop the criminal embezzlement charges against the family entity. However, someone must take civil liability for the missing $400,000. We require a signature transferring the final, unconditional deed of this property to AV Holdings, along with a signed confession acknowledging the fraud." "But if we sign that, we lose the house completely," Thomas stammered. "We'll have nothing. Where will we live?" "You can rent a small apartment in the city," Abigail said, her voice dropping into that smooth, low, late-night register. "Or, you can refuse to sign. If you refuse, the house goes to auction anyway, and Julian goes to a federal penitentiary for 5 to 7 years. The choice is yours. Protect the son you kept, or protect the house you used to hide him." From the top of the stairs, a door clicked open. Julian stood on the landing, his face pale, his eyes wide with a frantic, sweating terror. He had heard everything. "Dad. Mom. Don't let her take me." Julian screamed, his voice cracking like a child's. "You can't let me go to jail. I won't survive in there. You always took care of me. You said I was the only thing that mattered." Thomas looked up at his son, then down at the red foreclosure notice on the table, then at his wife. The perfect, unbreakable bond of the Vance family, the trinity of father, mother, and chosen son, began to crack right down the middle under the weight of Abigail's choice. "It's your fault. Eleanor suddenly turned on Thomas, her face twisted in rage. You ruined him. You always let him have whatever he wanted because he had your name. You gave away my daughter, and now you've destroyed my son. My fault? Thomas roared back, standing up and shoving his wife back onto the sofa. You were the one who insisted on private schools we couldn't afford. You were the one who couldn't bear the thought of the neighbors knowing we were broke. Abigail watched them scream at each other, her expression entirely neutral. She reached into her pocket, took out another peppermint, and turned toward the door. You have until 9 tomorrow morning, Abigail said over the sound of their mutual destruction. Let's see what $1 million boy is worth when the currency is your own skin.